Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka. Some time ago, in one of our previous episodes, my guest was Martin Kroupa from Paměť národa, the Memory of Nations project. And we agreed that it would be great to bring some of the remarkable life stories from their vast oral history archive to Czechast as well. And today, I have one of those stories for you. A story of love and loss, of wartime tragedy, and ultimately of hope. Joy Kadečková was an Englishwoman who met her future husband during the Second World War in wartime Britain. He was a Czech pilot serving in the RAF. And their story began rather unexpectedly on a dance floor that Joy was watching in her coat.
And suddenly somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, "Will you please take off your dress and dance?" I thought, my goodness, will I take off my dress? And I turned round and looked, and there was this wonderful Czech pilot. And what he meant was, would I take off my coat and dance? Well, I did take off my coat and I did dance.
That Czech pilot became her husband, but their time together was tragically short. He was killed in 1944. Joy was left alone with a young child and a promise.
I had promised my husband that if he did not return to Czechoslovakia, that I would come in his place. And I had always been brought up by my wonderful parents to, if a promise was made, it had to be kept.
So she came to a country she barely knew, whose language she didn't speak. She remarried after some years, and she would go on to live through decades of dramatic, often difficult history of this country, and refused to leave even after the invasion of 1968. And all that despite the fact that she learned only very basic Czech and spoke mainly English. By the end of her life, in already free Czechia, she had a clear sense of where she belonged.
I'm quite proud to be Czech. The Czechs have a very sad history behind them. And I think the Czech character has been formed actually by this character, by the Habsburg administration, the German occupation, the Soviet occupation. You had the occupation from 1938 to 45, and we had the war. Two different things, but both terrible.
So, this is the story of Joy Kadečková, an Englishwoman who became, in her own words, proudly Czech.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
I was born in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, but my whole family came from London. I went to a normal school until I was 10, and then I went to a secondary school until I was 17. Then I went to Pitman's College, and when I was 18, the war broke out. And so I stopped studying and joined the WAAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, attached to the Royal Air Force. And I joined up voluntarily. I did not wait to be called up. Later on, after about 2 years, English women were called up for duty in the Army, Navy or Air Force. Or if they were in so-called special jobs, they did not have to join the forces. But I went voluntarily before I was called up. I did my training in London at the RAF College of Communications. That meant doing radio telephony, wireless telephony, and later on I passed on to radar. After graduating from this college, I was sent to the combined headquarters of the Army, Navy and Air Force in Scotland. It was a very important job in a very, very important place because, as I said, it was the combined headquarters running the whole war. And I was there for a long time. We were working underground. We never saw daylight for ages and ages because we worked on shifts. And we either came up when it was dark or went down when it was dark and slept during the day in daylight. After that, I was on various airfields working as a wireless operator or radio operator. When working as a wireless operator, as you know, we had contact with the air crews only by wireless, by Morse code, and radio telephony. When we worked with radio telephony, we had direct contact with the pilots or radio operators, and the Czechs and the Poles communicated among themselves even when they were supposed to remain silent. This was very interesting because they were extremely vulgar. They had been taught a lot of really vulgar, horrible expressions by the English air crews, and they used them. And the situation had got so bad that the head office of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force had to apply to the government to, in turn, apply to the commanding officers of all the Polish and Czech air squadrons to remember that women were doing all the operating of communications, and to remember that women, we were girls, and that they must remember this fact and behave accordingly. Well, I can say it didn't help very much, but it was an amusing interlude during the war. When I was in London at that RAF college, it was at the time when London was being very, very seriously bombed, and we were billeted in Chiswick in London, not far from the centre. And during the day we were, as it were, at school, and at night we were out helping in the air raids and helping people who were bombed, and it was an experience that I would not wish on anybody. I can tell you one rather funny incident. Just before I joined up, which means before I joined the Women's Air Force, I was working as a working voluntarily as an air raid precaution member. The abbreviation was ARP, and that meant one took messages, ran around with messages during air raids or when air raids were expected at any moment. And I had been asked to take a message to a gentleman who happened to be at a dance at the local town hall. So I went to the town hall, stood in the doorway watching the people dancing and looking for this gentleman, or young man. And I didn't take my coat off. I was just standing there because I hadn't gone to dance. I had gone to do my duty. And suddenly somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, "Will you please take off your dress and dance?" I thought, my goodness, will I take off my dress? And I turned round and looked, and there was this wonderful Czech pilot. And what he meant was, would I take off my coat and dance? Well, I did take off my coat and I did dance. And what happened to the message? I don't know. I never found out. I didn't deliver it. But I think it wasn't responsible for us losing the war. We won it anyway, message or no message. But that was how my life with the Czech pilot started. And we didn't see each other very, very often because he was stationed in South England, and at that time when I first joined up, I was in Scotland. I used to dash down to London to the Czech club if I had a weekend free, and he dashed up to London if he had a weekend free. It all depended on that. We didn't get to see each other very much. And we were married on Christmas Eve, that's the 24th of December in 1942. And our son was born in May 1944. And sadly, my husband saw his son only once, because my son was born in 44, as I said, in May, and my husband died in October of the same year, so he only saw his son once. And when I became pregnant, I naturally, after 2 or 3 months, was discharged from the Royal Air Force. And after my husband had been killed in a mosquito, I worked some time up till the end of the war in a Czech ministry in London, and I was repatriated through the Red Cross through this ministry, and it was my arrival in this. I had promised my husband that if he did not return to Czechoslovakia, that I would come in his place. And I had always been brought up by my wonderful parents to, if a promise was made, it had to be kept. And although I was only 22, I came here with a child completely alone. And all I knew was, já ti strašně miluju, dobrou noc, a jak se máš? And that was all my knowledge of Czech. But I managed. But my arrival in this country was extremely sad, because when we arrived at Ruzin, there were crowds of people waiting for the Czech exiles, who they hadn't seen each other for about 8 years. But there was no one at all to meet me. So I stood alone on Ruzin with a child, thinking, well, my goodness, what do I do now? Very sad. And then some very kind people from the Red Cross came and took me to some building in Hibernska, where I was left to my own devices and spent the night wondering, well, what do I do from here? Where do you go from here? And before I came here, I had contacted the family of my Czech husband, and I told them I had to tell them the sad news that their son wouldn't return, but that I would like to come. And through the Red Cross, they told me they would be very happy to have me here and to meet me, and to let them know when I was coming, again through the Czech Red Cross. Well, I did that. I sent them a telegram, but they didn't come to meet me. And there I was, stuck in this hotel I think it wasn't a hotel, in this building in Hibernska. And they gave me for breakfast some frightful dark bread and that frightful jam. So I was presented with some, what for me was frightful dark bread and povlan, which I have never got used to. And after a little while, there was a knock at the door. I thought, oh dear, what happens now? And in rushed about 15 people, laughing and crying and with dictionaries. And I was laughing and crying, and nobody could speak for a little while. And 1 or 2 people among them could speak a little English, and they had dictionaries. And it turned out that this was my whole Czech family. And my telegram had arrived 1 day late. And that explained why no one was there to meet me. And I must say it was a terrible experience to land in a foreign country and not know the language. But the Czech Red Cross people were extremely, extremely kind.
What did you know about Czechoslovakia before you met the pirates?
Well, I did know something about it. I knew Prague was the capital, but geography at school in my days was not particularly well, it was a subject on a curriculum, but my professor of geography would come in and say, well, today we'll tell you Czechoslovakia and the capital is Prague, situated on the Vltava, consisting of Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, Silesia. It's mostly agrarian. They have an industry, the Skoda factory. Well, I think now we can do Africa. So that was our geography lessons, because they did not, very sadly, in England, sort of concentrate on geography much, because if you ever read the book How to Be a Foreigner, this book starts off by, no matter what country an Englishman goes to, all the population of that country are the foreigners, not him. And this was the general attitude, but I've forgotten why we're talking about it.
About your feelings, about your knowledge of Czechoslovakia.
Oh yes, well I did know something about it, and especially when I knew that I was going to come here. You know, I sort of swatted up some information about it, and my husband had told me something about it. But of course, when I was here, I learned much more. And when we came here, the English women had a very difficult time, because the Czech population thought we were Germans. And I could tell you some absolutely horrendous stories. I was spat on. I was nearly thrown out of a window on a train, because apparently someone asked if I minded the window being open. I had no clue what he was talking about. It was at the beginning of my coming here.
So it was some 1946 or?
No, I was the first English woman here. I came on the 4th of July, 1945. And it's a long story, but to put it very briefly, I was staying in the house of my parents in Melnik, and for some unknown reason, I can't remember why, I was alone. And a Russian jeep pulled up with 4 men, officers, and a woman officer. And they had buckets. And in the yard of this house, there was a pump. And they said to me, voda, voda. Well, I understood voda. I'm going to carry water for these huge men. So I just showed them where this pump was. They went into the house. I think these women had quite a difficult time when we came here, because we looked different, we were dressed differently. We couldn't speak Czech. And we really had a difficult time without my going into details. But anyway, the situation got so bad that the Czech radio had to broadcast several times that there were wives of Czech soldiers and airmen here who had somewhat different clothes, different prams, and looked sometimes as though they might be Germans, and to be very careful and not injure them or insult them and so on.
Do you have some idea how many of these women were here in Czechoslovakia? How many wives of Czech airmen?
As a matter of fact, I've forgotten. But I think at the beginning there were at least about 200. I may be wrong. But very, very, very many went back in 48. And then again in 68. And in between, there were English women here, and for the Czechs to be careful and not insult us as Germans.
How did you feel when you came here, especially after 1948? Have you had any idea of returning to England?
No, because I think if you make your bed, you've got to lie on it. No, I later remarried, rather sadly, but that's another story that I think is my business. And 68, I said to my children, because by this time, when times got rather bad, I said to my children, would they like to get somehow to England? And they were absolutely horrified. They said, well, what do you mean? We go to England. What about all our friends? Are we going to leave them here? So I was very proud of my children, because They did not think only of themselves, but they thought of their friends. And so we stayed here. And, well, ask your questions.
Well, what were you doing here during the 1940s, 1950s? I mean, what was your job or did you have any problems with your different nationality, especially on the start of 1950s?
What a funny question.
Well, so ask another, what sort of problems did you have?
You're very young. When I first came here, after 6 weeks of going around my family, I wanted to be independent. And I worked for some time at the British Council. And I must say the people at the British Council, there was another English girl there and myself. And the British Council, of course, for all Britishers. But there were only this other young lady and myself who had married Czechs. And we were considered by the people at the British Council as outcasts. And she and I decided that we were just as good as they were, maybe even better, as far as education was concerned. And we gave in our notice and left the British Council. I gave lectures at the philosophical faculty. And then I got the job at the School of Modern Languages in Prague, where I taught for, I suppose, 3 years. Did the state examination classes and thoroughly enjoyed the work. But in view of the opinions that were stated by the director of the school, who had been in Great Britain during the war and spoke very much against Great Britain in the early 50s, and I opposed him, so my services were dispensed with. And by this time I had remarried, and my husband was in August 1948. And in September of the same year, 1948, he had to go and do his 2 years military service. So there was I, left alone. No job, no money. And at that time, the wives of men doing their army service did not get a financial allowance from the government. So I had absolutely no money. It was a very tough time. I didn't know what I was going to eat the next day. And then someone said, well, why don't you get some lessons, English lessons? Well, I thought that was a good idea, so I did get hold of some people and got myself going, well, making life a bit better. And then, because of my British nationality, my second husband was not allowed to graduate from the Academy of Economics, and he had a great deal of trouble because of my nationality, as did my children at school. My children had a very sad time at school, and I could tell you some really horrible, unpleasant stories, but it's all in the past. And then, by this time, I had picked up Czech. I never had Czech lessons because I never had time. I had to look after myself. I had no one to look after me. And, but I picked up Czech very, very quickly. I don't know all the 7 cases, not even today. The case number 1 is enough for me. I don't need to know the other 6. And I was offered the job in 1968 as the chief editor of the cultural section of a magazine called Czechoslovak Life, which was published by Orbis. Now, I was an external worker, and I thoroughly enjoyed this job. It was, for me, absolutely out of this world, because I was working as a journalist and the chief editor. I got letters from all over the world. How wonderful this culture section was. I interviewed the most interesting people, including people like Lord Snowden and Czech celebrities. And then the Soviet occupation came. I walked around the offices shouting out my opinions. I never keep my opinions to myself when they're very strong, and raving about this occupation. And I had no idea that all the staff were practically estebazi. So again, I had to leave. And then from then on, I worked entirely independently as a translator. And I can say I did a lot of very interesting work in that. Right up till about last year, maybe 2 years, I stopped. From now and then, I do some translations for doctors then, publications or lectures and so on.
Did you know about the situation in your original home in Britain during the 1950s, 60s, or did?
I was in contact all the time. Don't forget, I had a family there, and I got hold of British newspapers and that. Oh yes, so there's no problem like that. It's true that. I had proof that my letters were censored. One proof came about like this. I opened a letter with some beautiful photographs in, very exotic photographs. Well, the background was exotic. And so I wrote to my mother and sent them back. And my mother corresponded with people all over the world. And I sent back these photographs and said she'd included them by mistake, And she wrote back and said she'd never seen these photographs. They just were not hers. So it was obvious that the customs they had, or the General Post Office, made a mistake, and put these photographs back in mine. That was absolute proof that they were censored. And I'll tell you a very funny story. My second husband was also dismissed from his job. And he did something absolutely amazing. He decided, well, I'm going to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Somehow I can't remember how he got there, but he did. And he said, what's this all about? Why has this happened to me? And they said, it's absolutely unbelievable. Well, your wife is British. Parents are British. And your wife's mother, not father, mother, could come to this country as a spy. And you would keep her. So, of course, my husband said, well, gentlemen, I'm afraid this is unbelievably stupid, and goodbye, and that's that. And he walked away. But this is such an amazing story that I don't think anyone could hardly believe it, that my mother, of all people, should come as a spy. Not a word about my father or my brother. Oh, yes, my brother was also a pilot. He trained in Canada and has lived in Canada ever since, well, not quite since the end of the war, because he was an engineer on the oil fields all over the world, that he finally settled in Canada. And because of the communist regime, I didn't see him for 40 years. And talking about not seeing our families, from 1948 until 1956, we British women were not allowed to go home. And then, that is another long story, but Englishmen were marrying German women. And these German women, immediately they went to England, got British nationality. Whereas we, when we came here, lost our British nationality and immediately gained Czech nationality. And in 1949, there was a new law, both in England and in Czechoslovakia. Both countries produced a new law. Because there was an uprising in England, a theoretical one, not a physical one, to the effect that British women were losing their nationality and foreign women getting it. So the British made a new law according to which all British women who had lost their nationality automatically got it back. And at the same time, there was a Czech law was made, or Czechoslovak law at that time was made, according to which if a foreign woman who married a Czech, wanted to become Czech, had to apply. So that actually now we all have dual nationality. But since we live here, well, those of us who have remained here, we have to abide by, the Czech law and so on. But we got back our British nationality. And
do you think there are some typical signs of Czech nationality? What makes Czechs different, for example, from the British or from the English?
Oh, that would be a subject of a very long conversation. Of course, there are differences. Don't forget that the British are insular people.
What does it mean, insular?
Insular, we have lived on an island throughout.
Yeah.
And you here, the people here, or we, now I'm one of you, are continental, surrounded by other countries, whereas Great Britain is entirely insular with the sea all around. So this made for different characteristics. The British all through the centuries felt, let us say, safe. I mean, we were invaded by William the Conqueror in 1066. That date, every Englishman remembers 1066. It's such an easy date to remember. There's no one will, everyone knows 1066, William the Conqueror.
Battle of Hastings.
And the Battle of Hastings, yes, good for you. And so that I think that had a great influence on the British character. And I have noticed, I've lived here such a long time, I naturally have noticed great differences, but I don't think it would be quite fair to discuss it.
If you don't know, we should not.
Because there are small things, very small things, like people. I remember one day I was in some office on some official business, I forget what it was, and there was a long queue of people, and my matter had been dealt with, and I was leaving, and I was just leaving at the door, and across this long room, the clerk yelled out, "I haven't got your date of birth. What was it?" And I had to yell back, and of course I was absolutely horrified, yelling back my date of birth. And at that time, I was still very young, so it didn't really matter. But for me, the hundreds of people in this queue, you and Joy Kadečková was born. It's absolutely shocking. I never got over it. I still think about it. That I thought it was most odd. And then, of course, here there are things like I mentioned it earlier. Certain subjects were absolutely taboo. One did not talk about one's politics, money, religion, and age. And here these things are sort of not secret. People discuss them in general. That is one very great difference. Of course, I have not lived in England for a very long time, but I think these subjects are still pretty much taboo. You don't ask people what political party they're in or anything like that, or age, and certainly you don't get an envelope from an official envelope with your date of birth on it. Oh dear, these things I found very strange, but I mean, they're small details. Well, one could discuss this for a long time, but I'm quite proud to be Czech. The Czechs have a very sad history behind them, and I think the Czech character has been formed actually by this character, by the Habsburg administration, the German occupation, the Soviet occupation. You had the occupation from 1938 to 45, and we had the war. Two different things, but both terrible.
So do you feel now more Czech than English?
Well, this is a very difficult question to answer because I've lived here the greater part of my life. I have lived here. More than 2/3 now. And if I went back to England, I think I would find it a bit difficult to acclimatise again. because life is different here. Living conditions are totally different. I found it quite a lot of fun. It was an entirely different life. And there's smaller sort of incidents like I said good morning to the people I knew, regardless of whether they were men or women. And I remember my second husband said, look, you can't greet these men. I said, why not? And he said, well, the men in this country greet the lady. I said, well, in my country, the lady has the privilege of acknowledging who she wants to know. If she doesn't want to know that man because he's an alcoholic or something, we just don't greet him. But it's our privilege. And then another funny incident in England, when I was out with my first husband. Mostly we spoke French. His English was not too good. His French was much better, and because he'd done French here, and all the pilots, airmen who had escaped, had to go into the French Foreign Legion, as you probably know. And I couldn't understand when we were walking, if we crossed the road, he would keep dancing round me. Sometimes he was on this side and sometimes he was on a side. Oh, my God, what on earth is he doing? Because in England, the man had to walk on the outside by the club, and still. And the reason dates back to the Middle Ages, or maybe even before, when people threw the contents of certain articles out of the window. So it's the man who caught it, you know. And then when I came here, I got to know that in this country, now I can't actually remember. Perhaps you can tell me, I can't remember, but the man had to walk on either the left or the right of the lady.
Left.
And the younger one had to walk on the left or the right of the older person they were with. There was this certain etiquette, unwritten law. As in England, the man had to walk on the outside. So I didn't know why my husband kept dancing around from this side to that side. And I never got to know in England. Nobody ever got to explain it to me. And then later, of course, here I found out. And you asked me if I feel Czech. Well, yes, I suppose in a way I do. I've been through all the modern history of this country.
So can you say you identify yourself with the history of this country?
I can, because I have always been very interested in it. If I came here, when I came here, I should say I made my own decision. I spotted up some knowledge about the country before I came, and I've lived through all the modern history since the war here, and I've had the same good and very bad experiences as the Czech people, because I was here. I didn't run away.
That was the remarkable story of Joy Kadečková, how she told it to Paměť národa, or Memory of Nations, in 2003. An English woman who came to Czechoslovakia out of love, kept her promise, and made this country her home. Let me add that after 1989, she was awarded the rank of colonel. Over the years, she received a number of honors and decorations, including the Medal for Merit and the honorary badge of the Czechoslovak military pilot. She was also active in the Union of Freedom Fighters and the Association of Czech Airmen, and later in life she also worked as a volunteer with the Salvation Army. Joy Kadečková passed away in 2006. If you enjoyed this or any other episode of Czechast, please follow the podcast, share it with your friends, or leave us a review. It really helps others to find us. You can also find more stories, articles and interviews on our website radio.cz. Thanks for listening. I'm Vít Pohanka. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay curious. And as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.